here's a situation that was already bad to begin with, and it's only getting worse. I am referring to the refugee crisis in the world. And if you want to learn more about the situation, if you want to understand what's happening, why is it getting worse, and if you want to learn what you can do to help as an ordinary citizen, then I invite you to join me in this episode of Changemakers Live. I'm Alexis Rodrigo, and I'm with the Strategic Communications team of World Vision Canada. And in this episode, I'm sitting down with my colleague, Mirette Bahgat, who is our child protection technical specialist. Now, Mirette has been involved in several programs responding to child or the refugee situation in different parts of the world. And in fact, just recently, she was in Romania and Moldova. And we'll be asking her more about that. In the meantime, welcome, Mirette. Hello.
Hi,
Hi, Mirette.
Alexis. Hi, and
Yeah,
hi,
tell us
everyone.
more.
And thank you for joining us all.
Yeah, tell us more about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I'm working with World Vision with the humanitarian team. I'm based in Toronto. I joined World Vision 3 years ago as the child protection specialist, covering our different programs, our different global programs. And before I was working more in the Middle East region. I'm originally from Cairo, Egypt. So I've been working for a lot of years in Cairo, Egypt with refugees and with also vulnerable Egyptian communities. And then I also worked with the Syria response in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And I worked briefly in Nigeria, also in the displaced camps in the north. So yeah, and as I mentioned, I'm currently based in Toronto at the moment.
Yeah, we'll definitely be getting more of your global perspective later on. But I always like to begin with the basics. What does it mean when we say refugee, that word refugee? Who is a refugee? And I also hear related terms like internally displaced person or migrants. How are these definitions the same, similar, or different from each other?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I keep getting this question also from my friends or people who don't work directly with refugees. What is the difference between all of these different categories? And on Monday we were celebrating also the International Day of the Refugee, so it's a very timely discussion. The difference really goes to the purpose of crossing the border. If we have someone crossing the border, are they from leaving their country and going to another country? Refugees cross the border because they are really running away from an imminent threat, from something that threatens their whole life and well-being, whether we're talking about a persecution that has to do with their ethnicity, with their religion, with their gender, or because of a war, as we see around the world right now, whether it's a civil war or war between two countries. So refugees are forced to leave their countries in order to protect their own life and well-being and seek shelter in another country. We also have to remember that this is an international right. They are protected by the 1951 Refugee Convention, that they actually have the right to seek protection in another country if their life is at risk at their country of origin. So the protection is actually an international right, and they shouldn't be in any circumstances forced to go back to their country if that puts their life at risk. A refugee is also, it's actually a legal status, and that's another misconception that sometimes people have. There is a lot of, I would say, stigma around the word refugee. Some people see refugees in a lesser status, but it is actually a legal status. So when someone is running away from their country because of a certain risk, they actually go to a country and seek what we call asylum or protection. And when they are recognized officially as a refugee, to have to have access to certain rights and services that are granted to refugee, this is a legal status, the same way we have citizens, the same way we have permanent residents, and so on. And all the world governments have they have to protect refugees. So this is the refugee and what we mean by a refugee. And then we have another two also, I would say, status that sometimes we get confused. We have a migrant as well. A migrant is someone who goes to another country, not necessarily because of a threat that puts their life in danger, but maybe because they seek a better life. They seek better economic opportunities. Maybe they want to like reunite with their family, maybe because they are seeking education in another country, but they can always go back and forth to their country of origin, and there is no immediate risk for them. So this is what we mean by migrants. And then we have the third category, which is displaced, internally displaced people. This
Right.
is almost the same, I would say, condition as refugees. So they are also people who are faced by threats, but instead of crossing the border to another country, they go to another area within the borders of their own country. So they are still under the protection of their own government, but then they have to leave their city and go to another city. And we see a lot of displacement, even in the current crisis in Ukraine or in Ethiopia or in other countries, where people don't necessarily cross the border, they just go to a different area. But they can also be one of the most vulnerable, because sometimes they go to inaccessible areas where they don't have any kind of services. So we also try to really reach out to displaced population.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So just maybe one last point in this
Mhm.
question as well. So this is it's really important to differentiate between these three groups. And then I think later Alexis will also talk about the difference between refugees and urban or camp settings as well. So
Yeah. So tell us about the situation of refugees, focusing on refugees. I didn't know there's actually legal implications for being a refugee. What is the situation of refugees, and what's driving the crisis? What's making it worse?
yeah, I mean, there is a lot of reasons. So if we're talking, for example, there is persecution, there is conflict between countries, political conflict, there is war. There's all sorts of persecution now around the world, whether it has to do with your gender, whether it has to do with your religion, whether it has to do with your ethnicity. So sometimes we're talking about a crisis that affects the whole country, whether we're talking about an environmental crisis or political conflict, but there is also crisis that sometimes affect individuals just because of who they are, what they're coming from. So, I mean, we currently have, and this is a scary number, we currently have 89 million refugees and displaced people worldwide, which is such a huge figure. And what's even scarier is that we're more than 50% of the 89 million refugees are children. So children are really affected by conflict and crisis. Maybe just to also see some of the main figures that has to do with refugees. And maybe we can see in the image here that we have, so we have 5 main countries where refugees are coming from. So I think maybe you can have the other image. So yes, so we have 69% of refugees are coming from just five countries: Syria, Venezuela, South Sudan, Myanmar, and we also have Afghanistan. And I'm going to talk about Ukraine later because Ukraine is a relatively recent crisis. But these are the five main crises with the largest number of refugees. And then we also have five major hosting countries for these refugees in the world. So we do have also an image with, yeah, here maybe you can leave this image also, because here we can see actually that over the last 3 decades there is like a spike in the number of refugees, and this is again because of all of the rising conflict and persecution. And then if we can go to the image where we see the hosting countries. So we have five main countries worldwide that are considered as the major hosting countries. And I think this is also a question that I get a lot of times, like, where do refugees goes? What are the countries that are actually accommodating of refugees? And we see Turkey topping the list, especially with the ongoing Syria crisis. And then we have Colombia because of course, the Venezuela crisis. And then we have Uganda, Pakistan, and Germany as well. Just going back to the Ukraine crisis again, because we didn't see it in the list. So it's a very recent crisis that just erupted in February, and the latest figures by the UN High Commissioner of Refugees mentioned that we have around 5 million. Currently, we have 5 million Ukrainian refugees. Those are the numbers that are just recorded by the UNHCR, but we also have 3 million Ukrainian refugees under the temporary protection programs, because some of the bordering countries in Europe that are bordering Ukraine, they actually now have temporary protection measurements for Ukrainian refugees. So we have 3 million Ukrainian refugees registered, which makes it a total of 8 million refugees. So it's currently now the second biggest refugee crisis after Syria, and it's growing. And it's a little bit different, I would say, than other crises, because we see also a lot of moving in and out of Ukraine. So it's not like other refugee crises where people leave the country and don't go back. We actually have a lot of displacement also in Ukraine, and some people, they cross back when the situation escalates, or they cross over when the situation escalates, and then they go back more on the western side of Ukraine when it is
Yeah.
slightly calmer. So
So I just wanted to emphasize that the number you gave us earlier, the 89 million refugees and internally displaced persons, that does not include refugees in Ukraine or from Ukraine, correct? Because the Ukraine conflict was very recent.
yes.
And so that number is actually a lot higher than it was last recorded in
Yeah,
2021.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And it might, unfortunately, it might get higher and higher, because in addition to the situation in Ukraine, we also have the hunger crisis that is happening right now because of the war, but also because of the climate change and all of the drought that is happening, and increasing of like fuel and food prices. So unfortunately, I think in the coming period, we'll really just see a spike in either the number of refugees or internally displaced people.
Yeah, it's one thing on top of the other. Now, you mentioned Ukraine. You were recently deployed to Romania and Moldova. And of course, you've also been to other countries where there are refugee settlements. So tell us, first of all, what did you see? in Romania and Moldova. And how is the situation there the same and or different from other refugee settlements that you've been to?
Sure, and maybe that's also something I forgot to touch on, but I think it's also very important to draw the distinction here. So we have different kind of refugee settings around the world. So you might go in one country and see refugee camps. So for example, we have maybe an image also here of the refugee camp in Dadaab in Kenya. This is a setting where refugees are they live in camps and they are not allowed outside of the camps without having a permit. So they are not actually allowed to leave the camp without a permit. And then in some other settings, we can see refugees living in like refugee camps, but they can come and go anytime. So the camp here is more like a residence area, but of course, because many refugees cannot afford, for example, to live in other neighborhoods, they just stick to living in this camp, such as the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, for example. And then in other situations, which we call urban refugees, this is such as in the case of actually Ukrainian refugees in like Romania or Moldova. These are, or Syrians in Turkey, these are refugees that they live in the city like other, they are not confined to a camp or a certain area. They just live in the city. They receive services that are accessible to refugees, but they just live in the city. And sometimes it's actually harder to reach to these refugees because sometimes they are not as accessible as if you're in a refugee camp where you know this is where refugees stay. I think across the board, what I've seen in all of these different settings that I've worked with urban refugees and refugees in camps, and I think across the board, the most important thing to remember is that refugees are, they are not like we can be a refugee at any given moment, and we have to remember this. If there is any conflict, if there is any situation, and we have to remember that people are in general are resourceful. And even when a crisis happens and they are forced to leave their country, this doesn't mean that they are totally helpless or that they have no resources or that they have no agency. Even if they need, of course, we cannot deny the fact that at the onset of a response, they need immediate access to life-saving services. They need immediate access to food, to shelter, to health services, to protection services. But on the long run, they also need to feel that they contribute to the country that they live in. They need to have access to education. They need to have access to livelihood. They need to have access to the market to be able to work and contribute. So we really need to remember this, because I think the thing that I keep hearing all the time is that we need to feel that we have agency, that we have a say in our life. We don't want to just rely on aid all all the time, and this is something that we really need to remember. And we need to remember also that in some situations when refugees goes to countries where it's a totally different culture, sometimes at the beginning we need to focus more on integration skills. So maybe access to like learning a new language or learning more about the culture of the host country. But then later on, we really need to shift our focus to how to make sure they are also supported to be a contributing member in the society they live in and not just live on the margins. That's, I think, a very important point.
Yeah, so it's definitely a complex situation. As you mentioned, there are different kinds of refugee settlements or camps. They're settlements. Some are temporary, some are long term. And their needs are also quite complex because they have immediate survival needs, and then they have intermediate needs where they just want to get back on their feet, and of course the longer term needs. Now, World Vision has been involved in programs around the refugee response in different countries and for several years now. Now, based on our experience, which interventions, which programs are the most effective in addressing the complex needs and situations of refugees?
Yeah. I mean, just based on what we were talking about earlier, World Vision really focuses at the onset of any crisis, we focus on responding to the immediate needs of refugees. And maybe we can see some images here of, for example, we do like food distribution or distribution of non-food items. This is a photo from the currently from the Ukraine response, providing shelter, providing clothes, like really just the very basic services. And again, it's like, imagine if you are a refugee and you just like, you had to leave home, you had to leave everything behind. What's the very first thing you will need when you're crossing border? You will need food, you will need shelter, you will need clothes to keep you warm. You will need also to understand what's going on, and this is why we also provide some mental health and psychosocial support, what we call psychosocial first aid. So it's basically just volunteers just calming people down, assuring them that we're here to support them, that everything is okay, that they are safe now, trying to also understand if they have an immediate need, because some people might have like a health condition, or they might even just be so distressed from the event that they need someone to just even calm them down and give them a glass of water, really. And also just understanding what are the available services, where to go to get what, because if I'm in a situation like this, you'll be like totally disoriented and you don't know where to go, for example, to get food, or where to go to get clothes. So it's important to have someone at the borders really just playing the role of support, like just making sure that, okay, we're here for you, don't worry, you're safe now. So this is what we focus on at the beginning of any crisis. But then we also try on the mid to long term. Again, as I mentioned, no one wants to live on aid their whole life, because you're really stripping them. And even when we talk about resilience and well-being, you need to feel that you're independent. You need to feel that you're contributing to the community you live in. You need to feel that you have a say in your life, and relying on others supporting you on the long run, like sometimes it actually has an adverse effect. So we need to make sure that we're also supporting them on the medium and long term to be independent. So access to education is very important for children. Like we make the very first thing we try and make sure of is that refugees have access to education. And sometimes we have to work with governments, for example, of the host countries, to ensure that refugee children have access to education, because that's not always the case. Like in some countries, they get like a different treatment. So you need to constantly work with the host government to make sure that refugee children are integrated into schools. You need to make sure that they have access to healthcare, free healthcare. You need to make sure that they have access to vocational training, to the job market, whatever skills they need to acquire to integrate into the job market. So this is something that we work on in the long-term crisis, what we call protracted crisis, really. So that's just a snapshot of what World Vision tries to focus on when working with refugees.
So before we go to the questions that were posted in the comments or in the chat, I have one last question for you, Mirette, and that is for the ordinary Canadians, what can we do to help refugees? It's such a big problem and it's happening halfway across the world. Can we do something?
Yeah, we can do a lot, and especially Canada is one of the biggest host countries for refugees. So I was even looking at the figures. Canada welcomed more than 1 million refugees since the 1980s, and in 2020 alone, we had 109,000 refugees coming to Canada. And I personally think that we should start with our country, with Canada, and making sure that we welcome refugees who come here to Canada. This is the first thing we need to do. We need to start with our neighbors, as we say. So just understanding more about, like, if we have a crisis somewhere else, what is Canada's role in ensuring a safe future for these refugees. We have to also understand that they go through a lot before they come here. So just trying to understand, trying to empathize, trying to really fight all of the stereotypes, because we hear a lot of stereotypes about refugees that, oh, like they come here and they just want everything for free, or all of these things that we keep hearing. I think we have to play an active role in educating people around us, in just understanding, like, what a refugee, no one wants to leave home at the end of the day. If you have a comfortable, nice, warm home, you live with your family and friends, no one would ever want to leave home. They had to go through a lot to actually make this hard decision. One of the movies I watched recently, I love it. It's called Flee. It's about the Afghan crisis, but like early on, not the most recent one. I encourage everyone to watch it because it really just, even for me as working with refugees, it opened my eyes to the hardships, and that we have to remember I can also be a refugee at any given moment. It's not just this group of people. Anyone really is vulnerable to these situations. But we can also, I mean, this is just starting with what's happening here in Canada, but we can always support also what's happening globally, like around the world. We have so many things. We have like Yemen, we have Palestine, we have Ukraine, we have Ethiopia. Like, I can go on forever on the crisis and what's happening globally. We can always like donate. We can hold like fundraising events. We can talk with our friends. We can hold sessions and try to talk with our friends about what's happening. We can do movie night and watch a movie about something that is happening and hold a discussion after. So there is really a lot that we can do just to support refugees globally.
Now, it's funny because the question that came in through the chat is actually related to what you mentioned. And the question is, how does Canada determine which refugees can settle in Canada?
Yeah, that's that's a long. Yeah, I think it's so, and again, maybe because for us as World Vision, we don't work directly with resettlement in Canada. We work more in international programs with refugees outside of Canada. So maybe I wouldn't be able to give an answer on this just because it's out of the scope of work of World Vision. But one thing I would do, Lisa, because I also sometimes I ask myself this question all the time, and being also a recent immigrant to Canada, I always ask myself, okay, like why do like Canada decide to host this number of refugees and that? And I think it's always good to check. I usually just check the Agency for Refugees, the Canadian Agency for Refugees website, try to understand what are these numbers based on, what is the process. I think it's always good to understand what are the criteria, how long it takes to get refugees, the numbers, where are these numbers coming from, and then try to make a personal there are things that we get the numbers, and then it's really up to us to form a personal idea of whether these numbers, okay, this is too high, this is too low, and again, playing an active role, because I think it's always important. I'm just going to put it out there. We always have to hold our governments accountable when it comes to refugees. That's something we always have to do. We always have to question. We always have to understand, why are these numbers? Why is the process too long, or why is the process short? I think as citizens, we always have to play an active role when it comes to our countries hosting refugees and being able to host refugees, because as I mentioned earlier, it is the right, like it is an international law that a lot of countries are abiding by to actually provide protection to refugees. That's a right for any refugee.
Well, there's still so many questions, Mirette, but unfortunately, our time has run out. I want to thank everyone who joined us live. Thank you, Mirette. Thank you in the future to the people who are watching the recording. If we didn't get to your question, please just post them as a comment, because we will go back and respond to all those questions. In the meantime, if you would like to learn more about the refugee crisis, we do have several articles on the World Vision Canada website, and we are posting a link to one of them in the comments right now. There's more links in the description for this video, so check those out. And join us next month. We will be talking about child early and forced marriage. So, yeah, and as usual, if you found this informative and helpful, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And follow us on your favorite social media platform so that you will always be notified of the latest episode of Changemakers Live and all the other programs that we have for the most neediest children and communities in the world. Thanks again, Mirette, and
Thank you so
have a
much.
good day, everyone.
Have a good
Bye.
day. Bye.